Welcome to Sundays in Song. My name is Doug Buchanan, and I'm here with composer Alexis Ward. Alexis, thank you so much for agreeing to say a few words about your music with us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me and for programming my piece.
Absolutely. We've enjoyed getting to know your piece, To Lumen, which is, of course, a piece about light. A perfect piece for an epiphany season, particularly as we slowly are getting more and more sunlight during the day, and we're still sort of in this season of light. Could you tell me a little bit about your initial approach to that piece, and maybe what drew you to the text and to writing that?
Certainly, yeah. I wrote it it's been several years now, actually, since I wrote To Lumen. It was, in fact, part of a larger work. It was a cantata for the season of Lent. However, the text I found is actually from an Advent liturgical text.
That makes sense too. Yeah.
I loved the excerpt for that reason, that it was it had a universality about it, seasonally. And since the piece was premiered, the full Lenten cantata, that movement, the To Lumen, has really been singled out as a piece that can really fit in many seasons. It does encapsulate that theme of light, and I think that there's just sort of a humble prayerfulness to the piece that can really set the tone nicely for the service. It was intended to be the prelude for this cantata, and it sort of set the tone for the rest of the service. I think the reason I loved the text so much, the translation talks a lot about it's sort of entreating the Lord to hear our prayers. It's very humble, but it's also intimate. And I just, at the time that I wrote that just really spoke to me. And when I write music, I do love Latin texts because of the vowels and the sounds that you can create with some of those words. And so we did sing it in the Latin instead of the English translation. But yeah, that was kind of the origin story of To Lumen.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the cantata as a whole, about how long and sort of the emotional scope of it?
Sure. It was an 11 movement cantata. It was called O Most Blessed Light. And I think the idea behind it was, Lent can be sort of a darker time, and it's very introspective, very contemplative. So I think that myself and our music ministry at the time and pastoral staff really wanted to offer something hopeful for that season. And so a lot of the music in that cantata is a lot brighter than maybe something you would hear typically during Lent. And every movement had a text that focused on light or hope. And so, as I said, To Lumen was the prelude for the cantata, and what that really did was sort of set the tone for the rest of the piece as a whole. And so a lot of the colors that you hear in To Lumen are echoed throughout the rest of the work. It does end on a pretty triumphant note, which I wouldn't normally have done during the season of Lent. But again, our pastoral staff at the time was really trying to focus on the light and hope aspect as it led us into Eastertide, into Holy Week and Eastertide. So that was kind of it in its original context.
Sure. That sounds fascinating, and it is interesting to hear pieces that are perhaps intended to be performed in one context, but show a different vein than we might normally associate with that. I think of other works like the Duraflay Requiem, the Duraflay and Fauré Requiems, which are taking that Requiem text but lighten it in some ways, not in terms of reducing any potency, but in terms of just offering an alternate way to view that. And I think a lot of liturgical composers end up dealing with that in some way, shape, or form, because there's practicalities to writing for for liturgy that sometimes they can feel constrictive, but sometimes they can also be inspirational. And I'm wondering what has as someone who works within a music ministry, who conducts, who is a director of music, and is also a composer. What is it? And coming from someone who is also that, I'm always interested in hearing how those worlds overlap, how you make that work for yourself, because I think everyone has a slightly different answer, and what that's like letting yourself be inspired by or constricted by sometimes the necessities of working within a liturgical framework.
Sure. Well, I have to say, I mean, I am a bit biased because I spent so much time making music in the church. But sacred music speaks to me very much. And so I think I spent, about 11 years singing in the Episcopal church setting. And some of the best repertoire for choir out there is from the Episcopal liturgical tradition. But a lot of it requires a great deal of skill and agility that a lot of singers just don't have at 9 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. And so I find myself, one of the biggest challenges for me, I think, is writing music that is meaningful and accessible at the same time. And so with To Lumen, I knew that I wanted to take that piece out of its original cantata and reuse it. And so again, with the text being a little more of a broad subject that can be applied to different seasons, I knew that I would be able to use it in Advent. I knew that I would be able to use it in Epiphany. I knew that there were going to be other times of year where I could still use that piece. And even in just the technical makeup of the piece, it's lower in a singer's range. It doesn't necessarily soar up into the stratosphere for the tenors and the sopranos. It's short. And so my focus with the piece was to make it accessible. And, I had the luxury of composing the piece for singers that I knew. So I knew that they were very gifted and that they would be able to sing anything I put in front of them. But there's beauty and simplicity as well. And I wanted to make sure that was in the piece as well. And it's been sung, fortunately, by many different groups, adults and children. And so it's been interesting to hear those different interpretations. And it's been interesting to see the different times of year that the pieces ended up being very appropriate. And that's been great. That's been a joy to see.
That's wonderful. And I think that's great when you have something that exists on its own that can be applied to many seasons. It's nice to be able to see that reflected in different ways. And I think you're right that I have a colleague who talks about the difference that he sees between something that is simple and something that is simplistic. And it's okay to write, and as you say, there is beauty in writing something that is simple sometimes. And that's some of the pieces that I write that I'm most pleased with. Some of them have been an approach to writing something that is simple, that encapsulates the idea in sort of a crystalline fashion, and crystallizes that idea down to the bare essentials of what it needs to be, which and in the end does make it flexible, as you say, and makes it accessible to many groups to be able to perform. Well, we're thrilled to be one of those groups who can add to that performance and to be offering this during the season following Epiphany. Alexis, thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts as well as your music with us.
Of course, and thank you again so much for programming the piece. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope I get to hear it at some point. It'd be wonderful.
Thank you so much for Sundays in Song. I'm Doug Buchanan. This has been Alexis Ward, and I look forward to singing with you.